Faiza. Faiza is, you've got her bio in the booklet, so I won't reprise that. She's a senior researcher in the New Economics Foundation. She's an expert in the area of inequality and has written and researched extensively in that field. And today she is going to speak about different kinds of growth, green growth and different models and where they have worked. So I anticipate that will be very interesting. Faiza will speak for maybe half an hour so that we have plenty of time for Q&A afterwards. So if you have questions as you go along, if you can just keep a note of them, and we'll have the questions at the end.
Thanks for taking your Saturday morning out to come today. I was asked to talk about what kinds of growth, and I'm going to tell you up front that I'm going to talk about green and inclusive growth, and that is the kind of growth that we need. Before I do that, just quickly a little bit about NEF, the New Economics Foundation. We're a think tank based in London. We operate under the banner of economics as if people and the planet mattered. And we've been around for more than 25 years now, challenging mainstream thinking on issues from money creation and banking to economic value, well-being, and the environment. And we're currently working on a new model, economic model, that would allow us to think about how we could transition to a different type of model, different type of economy, without losing jobs and creating harm along the way. So today I want to talk about the challenge, why we need to have a different type of growth, why the old model of growth didn't work. And then really, I think so often as researchers we can get carried away with what the issue is and why we need to do something, but I want to demonstrate that it can be done and give you some examples of work that's going on in the UK and pick up on some examples that are happening across OECD countries. I have to say there is a bias in my research towards the UK, so I'd be interested to hear from you guys about other examples. So this is the current situation. Most of the political elite are just in a hurry to get the wheels back on that car. And that car is not in a good, it doesn't look very good. We put the wheels back on. This is an old model. This is the model that's not really working. And really we need to think about how we move to a different type of growth. If we put the wheels back on this is about sticking plaster when there's a real fracture. And there's reasons for this. Social justice, apart from the fact that the wheels fell off this car in the first place, there are social justice and environmental reasons. And let me just summarise those in a few graphs. So this is some data in the UK, and we came across it the other day. We know that for the US and the UK and several other OECD countries, most people didn't gain from growth. So while even during the times when there was high growth, median wages were stagnating, so people in the middle weren't seeing their wages go up. And we found this data the other day from the World Income Service series, and what there is the red line, which is the bottom 90% average income for adults. You can see a kind of flat line there. So that's effectively saying that 90% didn't see their income grow on average. And then you have the top 10% that, of course, saw a growth, but then the top 1% really saw this growth. And we spoke about this quite a lot yesterday. So growth for who? Who benefited from that growth? And this is a really interesting switch that's happened in terms of the growth in in-work poverty. So what we see here is, again, from the UK, or Great Britain even, this one shows where low income was placed, so what types of households. So back in the 90s, most people on low income households didn't work. That was the greatest proportion. So where work was thought as the key way to tackle poverty. And looking at that graph back in the 90s, there's some justification for that. What's happened is that's switched. So you see that the pink bar comes down over time and the orange bar is going up. And that orange bar indicates in-work poverty. So the type of growth that was happening did not result in the kind of work that gives people decent incomes. And so that switch is very important when we look forward to the type of growth that we want. So this is some work that we did trying to break down the sectors that give people good jobs. And what we found was that actually there's very much a split here, and you'll be aware of this, between what non-graduates are doing and what graduates are doing in terms of income. And so we picked out the sectors where non-graduates were working. And we found several clusters, so from hospitality, social care, retail, to construction, manufacturing, distribution. And we looked at how people are getting paid compared to their skill levels. And we found a big difference between the sectors. But really the point I want to make here is that you see here there's not much progression in most sectors for wages, apart from when you get to construction, manufacturing. Those tend to be actually quite gender biased towards males. And also the other thing to note here is that the good jobs for non-graduates, so those in manufacturing, wholesale, construction, those are the jobs that are forecast to decline in the economy. Whereas the bad jobs for non-graduates, so those that aren't offering good pay and progression, good hours and security, such as those in hospitality, social care, are forecast to grow. So if we continue on the way we're going, we're going to see that in-work poverty grow, and we're going to see this greater levels of insecurity in work. And that, again, is the gender bias there is towards females for the bad jobs. Okay, so we know that growth hasn't been good for most people. It hasn't delivered for most people. And then to look at the planet. Now, this is the graph, this is a diagram that shows interlocking. I'm not an environmental specialist, so I have to look at my notes for this one. So this shows 9 planetary boundaries, and these are interlinked biophysical thresholds. And beyond those, we're thought to have disastrous consequences for humanity. And we can see 3 of the 9 interlinked planetary boundaries we've already overstepped. So that's climate change, biodiversity loss, and the nitrogen cycle. And, people could say, so what? What's this got to do with growth? But we know, of course, that we are consuming at a rate that the planet cannot afford. And this is really, whilst climate change, unfortunately, has fallen off the agenda to some extent because of the economic problems, we do have carbon targets in place and legally binding for many countries. So Europe is already set to reach its target of a decline of 20% by 2020, and I think they're going to revise that up. Germany has a more ambitious target of 40% by 2020. The UK had similar to Europe, and then says 80% by 2050, which is really the scale of the reduction that we need according to the science. So we know it's not good for people, it's not been good for the planet. So I think there was previously this split between the kind of social justice camp and the environmental camp. And really it was the sense of, we deal with the environment first, or we've got to deal with poverty, we'll think about that later. But there is a problem here in that the two can exacerbate each other. So take, for instance, if you do something about inequality, one of the ways that it could have an effect on the environment is increasing consumption for all overall. On the other hand, if you do something about environmental degradation, you could, or do something about climate change and environmental degradation, what could happen is that you're closing or you're making it narrowing the opportunities for people to fly and have holidays and what have you for people that are already poor. Energy bills for those that are already finding it difficult will go up. So you're going to exacerbate inequality even worse. So this is about how you layer these things up. That's not to say you can't do something about inequality that isn't carbon neutral. Of course you can, but actually we do need to think about how these problems are linking up. And just to mention, when we're thinking about doing something about this, we have this problem with a lack of money, and people tell us, well, we can't, government's kind of struggling, we can't do something about this right now, we've got austerity, it's too big a problem. We had this very interesting presentation yesterday that is about, do we not really not have the money? But yeah, this is definitely the case, say, for some of the examples I'm going to show later on for local authorities that are seeing their budgets cut. So what do we do? It seems like a very difficult task. Where do we start? One piece of motivation, actually, is when you look at the well-being data. And actually, all this consumption, this overconsumption, this inequality hasn't made us happier in general. So there is something here about, okay, we're consuming at a rate the planet can't afford, we have high levels of inequality, but collectively we're not happy, and surely that should be an important aspect of what we're trying to achieve. And this graph here is, sorry, it's a little bit complicated, but what it shows is that for different percentile groups, the levels of consumption go up, and so the number of planets used. And well-being, here it shows across the deciles, we know is about the same, but this isn't about income, this is about footprint percentile group. But also what you look at well-being, if you look at, I didn't have that graph here, but if you look at well-being over time in a country and you see the correlation between growth and well-being, there isn't one. So you don't get a situation where as growth goes up, well-being goes up. That hasn't been the case. Right, so what do we do? And there's this saying that you should never waste a good crisis. And to some extent, we've already been wasting some very good opportunities. So we have this wish list. So decent incomes, high well-being. We want to protect the environment for this and future generations. We want to build a resilient economy. We don't want these ups and downs, which we know are very detrimental to people's lives. And for the UK, at least, we want a smaller finance sector. We don't want to be so dependent on one area. We want to rebalance the economy. So quite a list there. And what I want to talk about are two areas. So starting from the bottom up, what's going on at the local level to deal with some of this? And I talk about an example here from Haringey. Haringey is a borough in London. And they had a carbon commission that was set up a year ago. Haringey is a very unequal borough. It's the most unequal borough in London. It goes from Tottenham, which is where some of you may remember where the riot started last year. It's quite serious levels of deprivation. Up to Highgate, which is an area which is where George Michael lives. I mean, it's, bushy and green and massive houses. So it really is very unequal. And this is really interesting. So they set this target, right, we want to reduce by 40% by 2020. That was their local authority target. And they do have a real commitment to this for a local authority. Other local authorities are, say, looking at fairness and inequality, but then looking less at the carbon side. But Haringey, because of the political will, I guess, is very focused on this. So we were very much involved in this process. So I want to talk through some of that. And again, this is something my colleagues were involved in. So I'm going to talk about it, but some of the detail you'll have to find in the report, which is just up on the website. And I should say as well, this is very new. It just came out in the last week. So Haringey, under this motto, the climate clock is ticking, normal isn't working, we need bold solutions, we need to do something new. This isn't about trying to tinker. We need to do something new. So what will we do that's different to invest for prosperity and opportunity for the future? And they come at this very much through the environmental angle first. So what they say is the challenge is to harness the economic opportunities of addressing climate change and address the social inequalities within the borough. So what they're saying is, or what the idea is here, and this is in later examples as well, that because we need to reach these carbon targets and because inevitably that will create jobs, how can we do this in a way that also deals with our problem of inequality? And because they've been, like other local authorities, subject to continuing cuts in their budgets, they need to think innovatively and really have thought about different types of business models. And I'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, so what they did, they started off by looking at, okay, where are our carbon emissions coming from? And they looked at both indirect and direct. And obviously their household energy is a big area. And of course, industry is important. And then they looked to what can we do? What areas could we really work at? So homes is somewhere where they think that they can actively lower carbon emissions. They looked at energy, so that's the green bar there, energy generation, and some stuff around commercial, which was smaller, and also around transport, which they do have more control over. So they built this model, and they tried to include, they had their own wish list, which reflects very much some of the things that I've mentioned. So health and well-being is important, carbon, social justice, jobs and enterprise, and also local activism. And they saw local activism as very important to achieving their goals. I'll let you have a look at that, but I'll talk in more detail about several aspects. Okay. So they had these principles to guide activity and development. From developing a collective response to challenges, and that really is about bringing local partnerships together. I mean, one of the key things that you have to do is put this on the map. You know, people still don't understand how important it is to do something about this. So also, and you know, and Haringey is very different in this, about taking proactive action, not kind of shrugging and saying this is too difficult. Supporting experimentation and creating good jobs. So going back to what I showed earlier around the need to create jobs that deliver high income and well-being. Reinvest wealth to address inequality. And this one's a tricky one. I'll spend a bit of time speaking about that. Of course, when you're looking at this, you need to think about appropriate scale. So Haringey is working with neighbouring boroughs. And they want to measure what matters because they want this to be accountable. So 5 areas of recommendation that I want to talk through. The first is to create business models which reinvest wealth back into the borough. And I should say that there's a lot more detail in the report. I'm just going to go over some ideas. So one of the ideas here is to have an alternative energy supply mutual. And they've already thought about the ways in which they can get investment. And this really underlies a lot of what they're going to do here is that, of course, you do need money. And where do you get that money from in terms of austerity? Now, one of the things is that local authorities can borrow at a lower interest rate. So where can they do that? Where can they work with businesses? Where can they use community development investment funds, which are kind of long-term loans to households which they pay back over a period of time, or if they're elderly, once their house is sold. They also look at really kind of shared ownership models. So they're, again, very keen to to make sure that people have a role in this. So one of the things is to have a retrofitting cooperative network. And again, this is about using procurement methods, using the tools that they have, as well as working with partnerships. So one of the things that they want to do, for instance, is that they have, of course, they have a social housing stock. They have their own stock. That is somewhere where they can test and embed some of these potential routes to tackle both carbon emissions and inequality. So they want to ensure that there's this local installers to build skills in the local area, and that it requires work with the further education college. They do look to use some of the national framework here. So there is a Green Deal from the government. There are some uncertainties around that, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But they are also lobbying national government. So it is about local action, and where they find gaps and find problems, they will lobby at the national level. Okay, so building a low-carbon economy. So what they want to do is to create a hub of activity in the area. So it becomes known as somewhere that's good on this subject, that it's good on this issue, that has a lot of low-carbon small businesses. They're going to host a major green economy event. They're going to establish a low-carbon enterprise district in the Upper Lee Valley area, which is a part that is currently not very well used. They're going to use some of their local authority land and properties in order to incubate enterprises, and they're going to develop partnerships with sort of local media, etc., and national media to make sure that that gets out. On boosting innovation, again, this is about promoting the work that they do, and they intend to have innovation labs around technology, social innovation, and financial innovation. And this is, again, showcasing the work that they do and putting it on the map. Investing in low-carbon transport. Now, one of the headings they have under this is to go Dutch, is to think more about cycle lanes, to work locally with people about what can be done on transport, to work across boroughs to try and with the London Mayor to try and demonstrate how low-carbon transport vehicles could work. And there are problems in Haringey with some areas of transport in terms of there aren't tube links everywhere. So some of this is about long-term lobbying work. And again, because this is about strengthening community organisations in order to deliver some of this and to work together, they intend to increase the reach and impact of community and voluntary groups by supporting, again, awareness campaigns, but also about supporting them coming together in the labs, but also just separately as well, and to inform them of the type of work that they want to do. So I must say here that this is new. The Commission just delivered some of these ideas, and there's more detail up online. But they do have a delivery plan, and I'm sorry that I can't go into detail today, and it wasn't something that I directly worked on, how to finance some of this, and innovative ways. And the thing is that this is a really difficult task, and this is a matter of watching this space to an extent. I want to talk about national level action. And I think the first thing on national level action is acceptance. So this is the path to acceptance. I mean, I don't know where governments are in different places on this curve, really. I mean, to some extent, you can say it's denial, but then there has been some bargaining around carbon targets, so maybe it's just depression. And, this is partly also about the economic situation that, again, it goes back to that, just get the wheels back on, we'll think about this later. But really, then there really needs to be acceptance before there can be action. And there's been, in the UK at least, there's piecemeal action, and I'll talk about that. And I think it's because of a kind of still denial. Okay, so let's talk about some potential areas for action. And some of this is already happening in Europe and across OECD countries. So a Green Deal. So this is something in the UK. People lobbied for a new Green Deal. We were, and the New Economics Foundation were one of the groups that lobbied for that. The Green Deal is quite a small amount of money compared to, say, the German Investment Bank on this. So it's £3 billion. It's quite high levels of interest, and that doesn't work in terms of take-up. So if you want households to take up money to invest, they're not going to want to pay back high levels, even though you can say they're going to save on their energy bills. Low interest rates are key. And just to skip to there about the Green Investment Infrastructure Bank, the Germans have a Green Development Bank, which we're very envious of. And that has 0.5 trillion euros. And just in context, that's double the size of the World Bank money. And there it's very keen on low interest rates. There's a high take-up. High levels of investment, and they have linked up skills change, apprentices, and making sure that jobs happen. So really the thing with the Green Deal in the UK is that piecemeal action is not going to be enough. A Green New Deal, which is what we lobbied for, this is a government stimulus, and this has been done in other countries. South Korea, for instance, has a 940k job target, and I believe that there are other countries, but I'm not sure. Green quantitative easing. Now, this has been a really quantitative easing has been quite contentious because in the UK there's actually been I think £385 billion of quantitative easing now since the financial crash, and it's quite funny because initially we called for just 10. If you just did 10 billion of that, initially of course it wasn't so much of that 50 billion I think it was to start off with. But what's happened is that if you guys were here for Anne's presentation yesterday, that some of this quantitative easing hasn't gone into productive investment. What's happened is that it's inflated the price of assets. So whilst it has, there is evidence to suggest that it helps the economy from completely falling off the bottom, completely falling out. It is making the rich richer. It is making asset bubbles and wealth inequality worse. So this new study came out about that. There was a little bit of an uproar, but it really does support the case that this needs to go into jobs creation, and given the need to do something about the environment, it seems like a no-brainer, really. But there's no sign right now that that's going to happen. But the case is definitely building around that. And green regulations for construction is one aspect. I mean, it's smaller. We're not sure about job creation there. The construction industry, of course, suffered massively from the economic collapse, and they're not they argue that they're not in a place where they can invest and do the kind of regulations. So there's a very strong lobby against the types of regulations that have been put in. So those have been watered down. So just to talk about, I want to take the kind of Green Deal, quantitative easing, and a green investment bank. What could that achieve? What numbers of jobs are we talking about? What types of jobs are we talking about? Where could that fit in on our wish list? So we did a study. We had a Green New Deal group. We had a couple of reports. So this report out and cuts won't work. And we just did some simple kind of simulation modeling and said, okay, right, just for 10 billion invested. So if we did 10 billion of green QE, firstly, we looked at if you just invested that in onshore wind, that would increase in offshore winds, I think that is, increase wind's contribution to total electricity supply fivefold, create over 36,000 jobs. This is just 10 billion. Or if you didn't want to do that, there were several options. So energy creation, one thing is we could reskill 1.5 million people and increase the earning of those on low income by a total of 15.4 billion. And this would be about, going back to that, where the good jobs are and what sectors they're in, about good jobs, good green jobs in construction and manufacturing. Of course, there is a gender issue there, but I guess that's something we need to think about. In America, some colleagues of ours there did this very well-received report, although, of course, ignored, for 100 billion there. And this was a mixture of QE, government stimulus, and some low-level, low-interest loans. They found that they could, and it was a very detailed economic analysis, they found that they could create 2 million jobs and therefore reduce the employment rate by more than 1 percentage point. And this, again, was about creating good jobs, high income, bolstering employment in manufacturing and construction. And interestingly, they also compared that money to what it would create in the oil industry. And it found that it would create 4 times more total jobs than the same spending in the oil industry. So it tried to also kind of make that kind of cost-benefit ratio across the different industries. So just to think about kind of what's working or what's been thought of to work, that's going to work. I mean, the ingredients to success on this, of course, is acceptance, of course, is investment. But I guess given these difficult times, we do have to think about how government can spend, but also what can happen at the local authority level. And this is an opportunity for us to be innovative and think about cooperative models, mutuals. I know there was someone here yesterday that's a specialist in this area that could perhaps provide some more information on that. This is about creative thinking. It is about partnership working. It is about championing what works. But finally, and probably most importantly, this is about political will. And that lack of political will at the national level is really, I mean, not in all countries, but is really getting in the way of some action. And where local action is trying to take place, they are coming up against these national boundaries. So they can, I get this sense from Haringey that they're really going to try, and they really have this plan sorted, and they are, aspects of it I'm sure will work, but they will come up into clashes with national government and difficulties in, say, some of the Green Deal, getting finance from the Green Deal. And so it really is about making the case publicly as well so that we can put pressure on politicians. Some of the questions that often come up around this. So does this kind of economy that we're talking about, green and inclusive, does it require whole new economics? And I don't think that's true, actually. It's not about throw away the textbooks. Of course, there's a neoliberal agenda and an approach to economics that's been taken that has focused or seen inequality as a good thing and has ignored the externality of impacts on the planet. But we are working on a new economic model and developing a new plan and approach. Will these be enough jobs to plug the gap? How many jobs is this really going to create? I've given some examples there. Of course, it's not going to give, everyone out of work a job, but it's pretty significant. And at times when unemployment is growing, here in Ireland, where it's stagnating at high levels and stagnating in other countries, this is really an opportunity to do something about the unemployment problem. And ultimately, people say, shouldn't every job be a green job? Or do we just need to get the right, we can have some very green jobs, we can have some dirty jobs that aren't green, and they, as long as it all comes together. And I think there's still a debate about that. Of course, ultimately, we would want every job to be green, but there is a journey. So just to summarize, the old growth model did not work for people or the planet. We're currently wasting a good crisis. So if you think about that £375 billion that's already gone into QE, and 10 billion of that could have, created jobs, it's devastating, really. But there's going to be more QE, so it's about what we can do going forward. It is possible. There are ways in which the green agenda complements the equality agenda, and really we need to bring that out and harness that and think about how we can achieve those two goals together. There is some local action across OECD countries. So I was in a conference in New York over the summer, and there as well, people were talking about grassroots actions. There are things that are happening that are bubbling up, but we need national action. And currently there hasn't been enough support for that at the political level in the UK and the US. And also, this is a new area. So inclusive and green growth, these are relatively new terms, something that's been used in the developing countries as well, for something for them to aim for. And so we are looking for more evidence, more work, more research, and please keep watching our website. Of course, we're not the only people working on this. But really, if we're going to go forward at this point to use this crisis properly, a green and inclusive growth agenda is key. So just there's some relevant publications that you might want to look at our website. And I'll leave it there and wait for your questions.
Then investment as a... Oh, sorry. I just want to know what you think of the model of prizes as a vanguard to investment rather than an alternative to it. So like with the X Prize, where a $10 million prize is offered up and something like $1 billion ended up being invested in aeronautics to get a private service into space. And I read that guy, an article within a Wired magazine where he's offering similar prizes for better ways to clean up the oil off the Gulf Coast and things like that. And maybe, what do you think of a prize model as maybe something that could spur investment?
So prize money, so you're giving the money after...
Yeah, you offer a prize saying we set this target for a private organisation, and if you can attain that target.
Rob Wilson, thanks, Faiza, that was excellent. I'm on the board of part of a social enterprise in Belfast, which is one of the biggest in the UK. And it leads me to ask you about what your thoughts are in that regard. Obviously you've talked about how local action can move the agenda on and show what can be done. And you've just mentioned in passing cooperatives and social enterprises, but I thought maybe that would be something you could maybe develop more as where some progress can be made that others can. Say the one that I am involved with has a turnover of over 30 million. It's been growing at a rate of several millions a year. But growth in that context has meant social care, recycling, active labour market programmes, etc., etc. And I just wondered if you had some thoughts on the specific role of social enterprises in the kind of scenario you were trying to paint. Just briefly while I've got the microphone, endorsing what Dieter said, it always frustrates me we never have a proper debate in either Ireland or Britain about the additional member system as an electoral system, even though it's applied in Scotland and Wales, and even though it clearly has been shown to have all sorts of positive effects, including with the emergence of the Green Party in Scotland.
My name's George Evan. I spoke yesterday I happen to be from that slightly hippie place on the south coast, which you mentioned. My local MP is Caroline Lucas, the only Green MP in the UK.
Good people.
I was just going to make 2 points. One is about a theme which was raised by another questioner, growth. And one of the dangers when one gets into this green discussion is that one keeps coming back to this issue of zero growth. And now, it's important to understand that greening the economy need not mean zero growth for 2 reasons. Partly because what we're talking about is redistribution, greater quality, but mainly because people like Joe Stiglitz and various others have been reworking the concept of gross domestic product or gross national product, reworking the national income definitions, which include definitions of what are goods and what are bads. And if you put the right prices on them, you'd find that growth was perfectly compatible with greening the economy. So that's a bit of a non-problem. And then the second brief point I want to make is financing a green agenda. And sometimes said, well, we're all broke, there's no money. Well, we're going to find the resources to do this. Now, you quite rightly mentioned QE, but the problem is that QE, quantitative easing in its present form, is merely a standard central bank program of selling bonds. Buying bonds, open market purchases by the central bank. And that results in more cash in the vaults of commercial banks. And we all know, as you rightly said, that tends to lead to speculative bubbles in the market and very little in terms of real activity. Now, the notion of putting QE to work directly to work in the sense of building a green economy through a green investment bank, for example, has been floated, but it's always been shot down by the banks on the grounds that technically this would involve the central bank in a sort of dirigisme which is unacceptable. And it's time we actually stood against that issue and said, quite frankly, QE as we know it hasn't worked, and what we need is not a 3 billion green central bank green bank on the Chris Huhne model, but something much larger than that, something that's really effective. Thanks, those are my 2 points.
Okay, so just going back to the question on the low-income countries saying, rightly saying, well, you guys, took that path and used fossil fuels, why can't we do the same? And I think there's 2 things to say on that. I mean, firstly, we need to recognise that that's an issue and say, and of course we need to talk about green and inclusive growth and say that actually there's a better way of doing it. But also we do need to recognise that we might, and this is contentious, I guess, is that we might have to have higher carbon targets so that they can grow. And, as much as it's about redistribution within countries, we also need to think globally. And I think this is where there's a real sticking point, because politically, when it comes to the bargaining, we know that the high-income countries are in the best position and have the most power in that bargaining position. So yeah, I think that's a real sticking point. And as we've seen from kind of Copenhagen to Rio, I don't know what to say about that really. Yeah, it's a massive issue. A green job definition, and this is the thing actually, is that you can tell that this research is quite new, because there are different definitions of green job. And as I said, some people say, actually there's lots of green jobs already. This isn't just about retrofitting and engineers for wind farms. These are all types of jobs that are either carbon neutral or help the environment. And I think that it's better, I mean, in some ways, to say that we already have lots of green jobs is potentially damaging to having more green jobs. But we do need to adopt a wide definition. So I would say, yeah, of course there are lots of green jobs, and a sweeper is not making the environment any worse. But what this really is about, this whole green job agenda is about, we need new types of green jobs to tackle the carbon emission issue. And so we don't have many retrofitters right now. We don't have many engineers for the wind shore farms. We don't have very many green manufacturing products. So I think there's a bit of a kind of old jobs, new jobs, old green jobs, new green jobs situation. And to be quite honest, I think there are different definitions of what a green job is. So I wouldn't give you one straight sentence to that, sorry. I think the thing is about political will. I mean, I don't know why, and this happens on the issue of migration and other areas as well, is that actually we can expect some political leadership on this. It doesn't have to be just simply about, actually people don't want migrants coming in, or people don't want to do something about, or there isn't that sense, people are worried about other things. Political leaders must lead on this issue. And of course we need to do campaign and public awareness. But they can't just go, oh, well, it's not an issue right now. I mean, this is such an important issue. And I find it difficult to accept the notion that, oh, well, what they meant to do. So, political leadership, which comes back again about political will. And on lobbying and building alliances, actually one important alliance is with businesses. Now, for instance, the peak oil issue, which is that the number of barrels being produced coming out the ground is falling, or it's reached its peak. Big businesses have already written reports on this. There's, I know that Richard Branson and a couple of other big business leaders on this were talking about this, and they had a meeting with the Treasury, and we had a meeting about it at work, and just about, this isn't something that we can just ignore. Businesses also realise that there's going to be this energy point. It's so important. Oil is so important to so many of the things, functions that they have. And so actually there's something about some businesses, big businesses, that are recognising that this is going to affect their production and are getting ready for change and need national help, is to build alliances with them too. So, I think there's a sense, we do talk to businesses, but sometimes there can be a bit of a, they're separate and they don't support it. But actually some do want a national framework because they are aware that they're going to need to change and their production's going to need to change. Social enterprise and the profit. I mean, social enterprise is really key on this because it takes out the profit motive. And right now, while we're developing and incubating green enterprises and new ways of addressing carbon emissions, it may well be quite expensive, or it may well not involve a big profit margin. So where you can take out that incentive, I mean, that's probably why social enterprises are, or I would say, are very important to this. And I guess the question back to you, really, about why is it that the social enterprise you speak about has worked so well? And we know, for instance, that cooperative and mutuals and community involvement, they have all these positive feedback effects. And I'd be really interested in hearing more about, what it is that's worked, why it's worked, how you would develop that model elsewhere. And finally, on the question of growth, and of course we have to recognise that we can't have the infinite growth, that we had, the type of growth that we had before. We do have limits on planetary boundaries. But you're right that if we start thinking about the real price of things, if we start pricing in externalities, if we start creating jobs that aren't just about retail and consumption, but are about, having outputs are green and ensuring that we have low carbon emissions from houses, etc., we can have a good type of growth. So this isn't about zero growth, and we have this debate within NEF as well. This isn't about no growth. This is about, like good growth. But I mean, one of the things that we have to recognize is that we're going to have low growth. Many OECD countries are going to have low growth in the next 5 years at least anyway. And there has to be a recognition that we need to tackle, and then this is one of the reasons that people that care about inequality but aren't thinking so much about the green stuff, want more growth because they think that's the way to deal with inequality. So we do have to be innovative anyway, because we're not going to have those growth levels that we had before, where we were able to then tax people and redistribute. I mean, it didn't work to deal with root causes, but we can't even really go back to that in the short to medium term. So this is the time, again, to be more innovative and use this opportunity to say, okay, well, we're going to have a different type of growth. And potentially that there isn't any growth anyway could be used to say we can grow, but it has to be this way in this type of job creation.
I think that's probably a very good note to end the discussion on. We've started